Good evening, and if you're hearing this, you're probably in the safest place a Roman could dream of at night, far away from the most dangerous object in the entire empire, which is not a sword, not a spear, not even a political speech, but a small, ordinary, innocent little oil lamp sitting too close to something that absolutely loves to become a problem. Rome is warm even after sunset, the stones keep the day's heat like they're hoarding it, the air feels heavy, and the city refuses to fully sleep because it's too busy being the center of everything, and when a city is the center of everything, it's also the center of accidents, and Rome doesn't do accidents politely, Rome does accidents like a rumor that spreads faster than feet can run. You hear it before you see it. A distant shout, then another, then the kind of panicked noise that has no clear words, just human urgency, and the first thing you learn as a Roman living in a tall apartment block is that night sounds are never nothing. Night sounds are either drunks, fights, thieves, or the worst category of all, something that makes your neighbors start moving at the same time. In a narrow street, where buildings lean inward like they're trying to share secrets across the gap, a ground floor shop is still awake, because Rome's economy doesn't sleep, and the people who live on the top floors don't get to choose quiet, they get to choose between hunger and exhaustion, and the shopkeeper downstairs is doing what shopkeepers do, counting coins, moving goods, checking a lamp, checking it again, because even a lamp is a kind of gamble. The lamp is ordinary, the flame is small, and small flames are the most arrogant thing in history because they always think they will stay small, they always think they're only there to help you see, but then oil drips, not dramatically, not like a movie, but quietly, a slow mistake, and the flame touches that mistake and the mistake becomes a plan, and suddenly the floor is no longer a floor. It's a path for fire to travel like it has somewhere important to be. The shopkeeper reacts fast, because humans always react fast in the first second, and the first second is the only second that belongs to you. After that, the disaster owns the room, and he throws a cloth on the fire, and the cloth catches, and the fire grows in the worst way, like it's getting fed, like it's been hungry, like it's been waiting for someone to be careless. Smoke starts to lift, and smoke is the real enemy at first, because smoke doesn't need permission, smoke slips into everything, into cracks, into stairwells, into rooms where people are trying to sleep, into lungs that don't know they're about to panic, and upstairs someone wakes up not because of shouting, not because of heat, but because their body is smarter than their mind and it says, something is wrong in the air. A door opens, a head leans out into the corridor, and the corridor is already changing, because corridors in Roman apartment buildings are not wide, not clean, not built for emergency exits, they are built for, get to your room and don't ask questions, and now the corridor has smoke curling through it like a warning. Someone whispers, "Do you smell that?" and that sentence is the beginning of a stampede, because once one person says it, everyone's brain runs the same calculation. Fire spreads faster than help arrives. A woman pulls a child up, a man grabs a small bag, someone else grabs a blanket, not because a blanket matters, but because your hands reach for comfort when your mind can't reach for control, and then another door opens, and another, and the staircase becomes crowded instantly, because in Rome, people don't evacuate in lines, they evacuate in waves, and waves don't care about your personal space. Downstairs the fire has already found what it loves most, stacked goods, dry wood, fabric, oil, and the cheap materials that make a city cheaper to live in but more expensive to survive, and it climbs the structure like it knows the layout, because in a Roman city block, Everything is connected in the ways you don't think about until you're watching your home turn into something you can't negotiate with. Outside, the street wakes up, not with order, but with a mess of voices, because Rome at night doesn't have a single authority in the first minute. It has neighbors yelling, kids crying, people swearing, dogs barking, and the kind of frantic footsteps that sound like 1,000 small decisions made too late. Someone runs for water, because everyone knows Rome has water, and Rome brags about water, aqueducts, fountains, baths, fresh flow like a miracle, and still. When a fire begins, the first truth slaps you. Having water in the city is not the same as having water in your hands, right now, where the fire is. The nearest fountain is a few turns away, the streets twist, the night makes every corner feel longer, and when the man reaches the fountain, it's already crowded, because fire news spreads instantly, and people don't come to watch, they come because they understand that if your neighbor's building burns, yours is the next page in the same story. Buckets appear from nowhere, pots, jars, basins, anything that can carry a small amount of water, and the bucket line forms in that messy human way where people try to be useful while also trying to be the hero, and the first bucket goes back toward the fire, and the second, and the third, and by the time the fourth arrives, the fire is bigger and the buckets suddenly look like jokes. The street is narrow and people are blocking it, because everyone tries to save something, and saving something in a burning city means carrying it through the same tight space where others are carrying their own lives, and the street becomes a traffic jam made of panic, and panic is the worst kind of traffic because it doesn't have rules. Smoke is now pouring out of the building like it's breathing, and it rolls along the street, and the heat starts to bounce off stone walls, and you can feel it on your face, and you realize fire isn't only a flame, fire is a presence. It changes the air, it changes how you move, it changes how you think, and it makes people do the most Roman thing possible: shout, argue, accuse, and bargain while the building is literally on fire. Who started this? Someone yells, because people want blame as a weapon, because blame feels like control. Move, someone screams, because control is impossible and yelling is all you have. A man tries to climb up, because someone is trapped, and he's brave or stupid or both, and someone pulls him back because bravery is good but smoke is stronger, and the upper floors are now glowing faintly behind windows, and that glow is the city's way of saying, it's too late for the polite solutions. And then the sparks begin. They rise up, carried by heat, tiny bright insects of destruction, and they land on the next building's roof where dry material waits, and suddenly the fire is no longer a single building problem, it's a block problem, and blocks in Rome are packed like a basket of kindling, and everyone in the street knows what that means even if nobody says it. This is when Rome's firefighting stops being about water and starts being about a brutal word that sounds boring until it ruins your life: containment. Because the real strategy, the Roman strategy, the ancient city strategy, is not always, put it out, sometimes it is, stop it from eating the entire neighborhood, and stopping it often means doing something that feels criminal unless you understand the math. You destroy a building to save the others. A group of men arrives with hooks and axes, not elegant tools, not heroic tools, just functional metal attached to wood, and they look up at the next building and they don't see a home, they see a barrier that must become a gap, and someone points and someone decides and suddenly they are ripping away wooden beams, pulling down pieces of roofing, smashing parts of a wall, and every hit sounds like a betrayal to the family who lives there. Because it is their home, their bed, their tiny possessions, and the men with hooks are turning it into rubble. But in a fire, rubble can be a solution. A gap can be a wall. A destroyed building can be a sacrifice. And this is the ugliest truth about city safety. Sometimes the only way to save people is to break what people love, quickly, without permission, while everyone screams at you for it. Somebody shouts that the men are thieves, because in Rome, disaster and crime travel together like old friends, and it's not paranoia if you've lived long enough to see it happen before. Someone else shouts that the men are saving the block, and now there's an argument, because Romans can argue at a funeral, Romans can argue during a riot, and yes, Romans can absolutely argue while the flames climb. The bucket line continues, but now it's mixed with demolition, and the street is chaos, and the smoke thickens, and people start coughing in that deep, ugly way that means their lungs are collecting the city's mistake. Then, a new kind of arrival. Not just neighbors, not just random helpers, but men who look like they belong to something bigger, men who move with purpose, who carry equipment like it's their job, who have done this before, who know where to stand and where not to stand, because they've learned what happens when a wall collapses sideways. They are not soldiers, not exactly, but they have discipline, and discipline is rare in a crowd, and that alone makes them seem powerful. They are the kind of men Rome eventually had to create because Rome could not survive forever as a city that depends on improvised heroism. They are the beginning of a system, patrols at night, organized response, tools kept ready, routines built around the idea that fires are not rare, fires are inevitable. And the moment a system arrives, the crowd reacts in two ways. Relief, because someone is finally in charge, and resentment, because in Rome, authority always feels like it's here to judge you too. One of the men barks orders, and people actually listen, not perfectly, but enough to shift the street, enough to make a lane, enough to let buckets move, enough to let hooks swing without hitting a child. They push people back, because spectators become obstacles, and obstacles become casualties, and the only thing worse than a burning building is a burning building with a trapped crowd. The fire is now loud, the wooden parts crack like they're snapping under pressure, and the sound is terrifying because it's not a scream, it's the sound of structure giving up, and in that sound, everyone can hear the future collapse. A wall trembles, dust spills, and someone yells to back away, and then there's a moment where the world pauses, like it's deciding whether to be merciful. And it isn't. Part of the structure collapses, not the whole building, not yet, but enough to throw debris into the street, enough to turn one rescue path into a trap, enough to make the fire surge with fresh air, because collapsing walls feed fire the way lungs feed a shout. People run. Some run away. Some run toward, because a child might still be inside, because a neighbor might be trapped, because humanity is complicated even in an empire. And somewhere in all this, someone else arrives, and this arrival changes the mood instantly, because the people recognize the type before they recognize the face, a rich man's crew, private workers, private power, the kind of help that is not charity, it's business. They stand there and watch for a second, not because they don't care, but because they are calculating, because private power always calculates, and then the rich man himself speaks to someone whose building is burning and he offers a deal that sounds like salvation if you're desperate and sounds like theft if you're calm. I can save what's left, he implies, but first, sell. And the owner, coughing, sweating, eyes wide from smoke and fear, stares at him like he's seeing the true face of Rome, because this is Rome too, a city where even a fire can become a negotiation, where disaster is not only tragedy, it's opportunity, and if you don't have power, the price you pay is always higher than the flame itself. The crowd mutters, because they've seen this pattern, because Rome repeats itself, because Rome has traditions, and one of those traditions is that the weak suffer twice, once from the event, once from the people who profit from it. Above, the sky is stained with smoke, and the orange glow reflects off low clouds like the city is painting the night with warning. And this is just one fire. Not the famous one. Not the history book one. Just a normal Roman fire on a normal Roman night, the kind that happens often enough that people have opinions about it, enough that landlords rebuild quickly with the same cheap materials, enough that families learn to keep a small bag ready, enough that the city develops habits around disaster the way other cities develop habits around weather. Because in Rome, the weather is sometimes smoke. And the most boring truth, the one nobody writes poems about, is that a great empire is not only held together by laws and legions, it's held together by the ability to stop neighborhoods from turning into ash, by patrols walking at night, by buckets, by hooks, by men who know where to stand, by routines that look dull until the day you need them. The fire rages, the street shakes with noise, and somewhere in the crowd, someone realizes a quiet, terrifying thought. If the wind changes, this is not one block. If the wind changes, this is a district. If the wind changes, Rome itself becomes a story told by people who survived. And the night is not over. You don't see them at first because Rome's streets eat light, they bend and twist and hide everything behind corners, but then you hear the rhythm, the footsteps that aren't panicked, the voices that aren't screaming, the sound of order arriving like a cold wind, and in the middle of that burning street, where everyone is trying to save something and nobody can agree on what matters most, these men push forward like they've done it 100 times because they have, and the strangest part is that they don't look surprised, not even a little, as if Rome catches fire so often that disaster has become a normal appointment. They move through the crowd the way a boat cuts through water, not because the crowd wants to part, but because authority has weight, and the vigilas carry that weight in their posture and their pace, and in the way they don't stop to argue with the first angry man accusing them of being late, because the first angry man is always there in every crisis, screaming as if screaming changes physics. And the vigilas don't waste time on him because time is the only thing the fire respects. The first thing they do is not throw water, it's not the cinematic part, it's the boring part that actually saves people. They start clearing space, they start pushing bodies back, they start creating a lane in a street that was never designed for lanes, because the biggest enemy in the first minutes isn't the flame, it's the crowd choking the street like a living cork, and you can't carry buckets, you can't swing hooks. You can't pull someone out of a doorway if there are 50 people pressed against each other yelling the same sentence with different words. One of them points to the ground floor doorway where the smoke is thickest, and he doesn't point like he's asking, he points like it's already decided, and a pair of men move in with cloths wrapped over their faces because they've learned the same lesson every city learns sooner or later, which is that smoke kills faster than fire, and the moment you breathe it deep you stop being helpful and you become one more person someone has to drag out. They come back out coughing anyway, because nobody wins a fight with smoke, they only survive it, and one of them shouts something that nobody in the crowd understands clearly because the crowd doesn't speak in clarity, it speaks in panic, but the other vigilas understand, and that's the point. A system doesn't need everyone to understand, it only needs the people inside it to act together. Buckets start moving again, faster now, not because the crowd magically became disciplined, but because someone is forcing discipline into the street with authority and habit, and the bucket line becomes a real line instead of a messy circle, and every time a bucket reaches the front it looks embarrassingly small compared to what's burning, but it isn't useless. Because in a fire like this the goal isn't always to kill the flame in one dramatic moment, the goal is to slow it, to lower it, to keep it from jumping, to buy minutes, because minutes are the currency of survival and Rome spends them like it's always on the edge of bankruptcy. Someone tries to rush back into the building, screaming that their child is inside, and this happens in every fire in every era, the moment where love becomes a sprint toward death, and two vigilas grab the person and hold them back, and it looks cruel from the outside because nobody wants to be held back from their own blood, but it's actually mercy because if you go in blindly you don't save the child, you only add another body to be rescued, and the crowd hates them for that, because crowds hate anything that feels like no, but rules are built from the hard math of tragedy, and Rome has done this math too many times. The heat is stronger now, the fire has climbed into the structure, and you can hear wood complaining, not with words but with cracks and pops that sound like the building is breaking bones, and you see sparks lifting up, and that's when the vigilas stop pretending this is only about water, because water is the polite option, water is the first attempt, water is what you do when the fire is still a negotiable problem. But when sparks start scouting for rooftops, the fire is no longer negotiable. It's expanding its territory. A hook comes up, a long tool with an ugly purpose, and the way it's held tells you everything, because it's not held like a weapon against a person, it's held like a weapon against property, and there is a difference, and in that difference lives the cold logic of containment, because if the next building catches, then the whole street becomes an oven, and if the whole street becomes an oven, then the district becomes a story told by people who got out early. They don't ask permission from the landlord, because the landlord isn't here, the landlord never is, the landlord exists only when rent is due, but the fire exists right now, and the vigilas hook into wood and pull, and a piece of roof comes down, and the crowd screams because it looks like destruction, and it is destruction, but it's controlled destruction. It's a sacrifice cut into the city to stop the flame from crossing like a thief. One man in the crowd shouts that they're destroying homes, another shouts that those homes were already going to burn, another shouts something useless, and the vigilas don't answer, because if you answer every shout you never finish anything in Rome, and Rome's disasters don't wait for debates. And in the middle of all this, you notice something else, something that makes the scene feel darker, because not everyone who arrives to help, some arrive to watch, some arrive to steal, because disaster loosens locks and distracts eyes, and thieves love a crowd because a crowd is the best camouflage, and you can see a man slipping along the edge of the street, not carrying water, not coughing from smoke, not shouting for family, just moving with that quiet focus that says he's thinking about valuables, and if you've lived in Rome long enough you've seen this too, the second disaster that follows the first disaster like a shadow. The vigilas notice him, because they're not only firefighters, they're also night authority, and authority in Rome doesn't separate tasks neatly, it bundles them, because the city is too messy for clean job descriptions, and one of the vigilas steps toward the man and the man suddenly becomes very interested in leaving, and that's how you know he wasn't here for heroism. Now the fire surges again, and you see why the vigilas are always walking at night, because the difference between a small fire and a district-level fire is sometimes only the time it takes someone to notice, and if nobody notices, the fire becomes the only thing that notices, and it grows in the dark like a rumor with teeth. A shout goes up from the front line, a warning, and people back away, because a section of wall is shifting, and you can feel the crowd's fear change shape, because fear has stages, first it's noise, then it's confusion, then it's that quiet heavy moment where everyone realizes the building might come down and nobody wants to be the one standing where it lands. The vigilas force a wider clearing, they push people farther back, because a collapse doesn't care if you're brave, it doesn't care if you're innocent, it only cares where you are standing, and suddenly the street looks like a battlefield in the least glorious way, not swords, not banners, just smoke, debris, heat, and human bodies trying to stay alive. And then it happens, not the full collapse, but the kind of partial collapse that's almost worse because it turns the situation into a trap, a beam drops, a wall section crumbles, dust explodes into the air like the building exhaled its last breath, and the fire reacts to that rush of air like a beast being fed, and the flames roar brighter for a moment, and the crowd screams in one voice. And in that scream you can hear why Rome had to build a system, because without a system this moment would turn into pure slaughter. One of the vigilas runs forward anyway, because systems are made of humans and humans still do insane brave things, and he's not running like a hero, he's running like a worker who knows exactly what he's doing. He grabs someone near the doorway who has fallen, drags them back by the shoulders, and you see the person's face coated in soot, eyes wide, and you realize they were seconds away from becoming a quiet tragedy nobody would count. Water keeps coming, hooks keep pulling, and slowly, painfully, the fire stops expanding as fast, not because it's defeated, but because it's being boxed in, and boxing in a fire is like boxing in an angry animal. You don't win, you just keep it from reaching the rest of the city. And somewhere in the background, like the worst kind of irony, you can still hear a tavern laughing, because Rome is so large that one street can be burning while another street is still drinking, and that's the final boring truth of the empire. The city doesn't unite around your disaster, the city is too big, too busy, too indifferent, and that's why you need an organized force, because neighbors alone can't protect you. Not consistently, not fast enough, not in a city that never stops being dense and flammable. The night goes on, the heat slowly begins to drop, and you can feel the exhaustion coming into everyone's bones, because fighting fire is not one action, it's hours of carrying, pulling, coughing, stepping back, stepping forward, watching sparks, watching roofs, watching walls, and the vigilas stay until it's not a wildfire of panic anymore, until it becomes a grim cleanup, until the danger is mostly smoke and embers and the possibility of the fire waking up again like it regrets falling asleep. And then, when the flames finally shrink into something smaller, something less hungry, the street looks ruined, wet, broken, blackened, like the city got punched in the face, and people start searching the rubble for anything that can be saved, and this is where the next story begins, because a fire isn't only the night it happens, a fire is also the morning after, the arguments, the rebuilding, the scams, the blame, the landlords pretending they care, the city deciding what rules will exist. Now because the old ones clearly weren't enough. And as the sky lightens slightly, as if dawn is trying to pretend it didn't see any of this, you can almost hear Rome making its favorite decision, to move on, quickly, loudly, with the same old habits, until the next night, until the next lamp, until the next street learns the same lesson again. The dust from the falling beam hangs in the air for a second like a dirty curtain, and everyone does the same instinctive thing at once. They step back but they keep staring, because in a fire your eyes become your only sense of control, and if you look away it feels like the flames will take that as permission to grow faster, even though fire doesn't need permission, it only needs space and air and one more surface to climb. The vigiles start pushing harder now, not because they enjoy shoving people around but because the moment a structure begins to fail the crowd becomes the next disaster, and in Rome a collapsing wall isn't just a collapse, it's a blockage. It turns a narrow street into a plugged bottle, it traps the bucket line, it traps the rescuers, it traps the people who still think they can run inside for one last grab of valuables. And the difference between a scary night and a mass casualty is often just the width of a single human lane. Water keeps moving forward in a rhythm that looks almost calm from a distance, empty bucket goes back, full bucket goes forward, hands pass clay and wood and metal like the whole street is a machine trying to act like it was designed on purpose. And every time a bucket hits the front it feels insulting compared to the wall of heat, but it isn't useless, because the goal right now isn't a heroic instant victory, it's slowing, cooling, buying minutes, and minutes are the only currency that matters when your building is deciding whether it wants to stand or become rubble. One of the vigiles points up at the adjacent roofline, not dramatically, just a quick sharp gesture, and you see why, because sparks are lifting and drifting like they're alive, and they don't fall straight down, they ride the hot air and they search for somewhere dry, and a dry roof in a packed city block is basically an invitation, and this is the moment when firefighting stops being polite and becomes architectural surgery. Hooks come out again, long poles with metal mouths that bite into beams and boards, and the men using them don't look like they're fighting a flame, they look like they're fighting the city itself, pulling apart the very thing everyone is trying to save, because containment in an ancient city is brutal logic, you don't argue with it, you either create a gap or you watch the fire create its own path across rooftops. A section of awning gets yanked down, then another, and the crowd protests like the building is being murdered in front of them, which in a way it is, but the vigiles don't stop, they've seen what happens when you hesitate. Hesitation is how one building becomes two, then four, then a whole street, and suddenly you're not saving a home anymore, you're trying to save a district while people scream your name like you're a villain. Someone tries to surge forward again, desperate, half-mad, shouting about a chest of money or a family heirloom or a set of papers that can't be replaced, and two vigiles catch him by the arms and slam him backward into the crowd, and it looks cruel until you notice his eyelashes are already damp from heat and smoke and his lungs are already losing the argument, because if he goes in now he doesn't come out carrying treasure, he comes out as a problem other people have to solve. The street noise changes as the reality settles in, less shouting with full sentences, more coughing, more short barks of warning, more people learning that smoke makes you stupid, it steals your strength, it makes you forget where you are, it makes you chase the wrong doorway, and that's why the men at the front keep their cloths over their faces and keep their movements tight, because they've learned the oldest lesson in the most boring way possible, by watching people pass out from air before the flames ever touched them. On the edges of the chaos, the second kind of crowd appears, the silent ones who aren't holding buckets and aren't looking for missing family, the ones who hover near doorways and abandon bundles, and you don't need to ask what they are, because every city disaster creates the same shadow economy. Someone always shows up to profit from the moment when everyone else is too distracted to protect their own pockets. A VGI steps toward one of them and the man immediately changes direction like he suddenly remembered an urgent appointment somewhere else, and it's a small detail but it tells you what Rome really is at night, a city where fire is the headline and theft is the footnote, and both happen so often that people barely look surprised anymore. Then another crack runs through the building, sharper this time, and the front line shifts, not in panic, in practiced caution, because this is the part the crowd never understands, the part that looks like cowardice until you've seen a wall come down sideways and erase anyone standing too close, and the vigilas widen the cleared space again, they force more distance. They sacrifice a little control at the front to prevent total chaos when the structure finally decides it's done pretending. A partial collapse happens, a slab of material drops, dust explodes, and the fire flares brighter for a heartbeat like it's excited by the sudden air, and the crowd screams as one creature, and in that scream you can hear the exact reason Rome needed an organized night force, because if nobody is directing the movement right now the street becomes a stampede, and a stampede in a narrow lane kills people faster than flames. One VGI runs in anyway, fast and low, and it isn't a heroic pose, it's a worker's movement, direct, economical, and he drags someone back from the doorway by the shoulders, a person covered in soot with eyes wide like they just came back from somewhere the living aren't supposed to go, and the moment they hit fresh air they start coughing like their body is trying to eject the entire night. The bucket line keeps feeding the front, the hooks keep tearing away the fire's bridges, and slowly the fire's appetite stops growing, not because it's defeated, but because it's being boxed in, and boxing in a fire feels less like victory and more like holding a heavy door shut while something angry pounds from the other side. Hours pass in a blur of heat and wet stone and shouted instructions, and when the flames finally shrink down to stubborn pockets the street looks like it's been chewed, blackened walls, broken beams, puddles reflecting orange light, and people begin to move differently now, less running, more searching, because the human mind shifts quickly from survive to salvage, and in Rome salvage is almost a religion, because losing everything is common enough that people treat something left like a miracle. The first pale hint of dawn makes the smoke look even dirtier, and that's when the next phase begins without anyone announcing it, because in Rome a fire isn't just a night event, it's a morning problem, it's blame, it's rebuilding, it's arguments, it's opportunists offering quick repairs with cheap wood, it's landlords counting loss and planning how to squeeze rent out of whoever is left. And while the street is still steaming, people are already bargaining over the bones of what used to be home. The morning doesn't arrive like a clean ending, it arrives like an insult, pale light sliding over smoke-stained stone as if the sun is pretending it had nothing to do with what happened, and the street that was chaos a few hours ago is now quiet in a different way, not peaceful, just exhausted. The kind of quiet that happens after people realize they've spent all their shouting and still lost the same things anyway. The first thing you notice in daylight is how small everything looks compared to the night's fear. The burnt doorway that seemed like the mouth of a monster is just a blackened rectangle now. The collapsed section that felt like the end of the world is a messy pile of beams and plaster and broken pottery. And yet the smell makes it impossible to pretend it's over, because the smell of smoke clings to stone the way guilt clings to memory. And even when the flames are gone, the air keeps telling you what the city did while you were trying to breathe. People step forward carefully, not because they're scared of fire anymore, but because they're scared of the ground, because a burned building is not a dead building, it's a tired one, and tired structures fall without warning, and Rome has always been good at teaching people to fear the quiet threats as much as the loud ones. Someone kneels near the rubble and starts pulling at debris with bare hands, not dramatically, just mechanically, because salvage begins the moment your body accepts you survived, and the things people reach for are never what outsiders would guess, not valuables first, but familiar objects, a cooking pot, a small statue, a tool, a bundle of cloth. Because familiar things prove your life existed before the fire and might exist after it too. Then the arguments begin, because arguments in Rome don't require energy, they generate it, and the first argument is always about blame. Someone says it was the shopkeeper's lamp, someone says it was the neighbor's cooking fire, someone says it was those lamp makers who keep oil too close to heat, someone says it doesn't matter who started it, someone else says it matters because someone has to pay. And in the middle of that you realize blame is less about truth and more about survival. Because whoever wins the blame argument can sometimes win a favor, or a discount, or a moment of pity, and pity is a resource in a city where resources are constantly being taken. A landlord finally appears, not running, not coughing, not carrying buckets, because landlords rarely arrive during emergencies, landlords arrive during accounting. He steps carefully over wet stones like he's avoiding responsibility by not stepping on it, and he looks at the ruined building the way a butcher looks at a carcass, calculating what's left, what can be rebuilt fast, what can be charged again. And the tenants watch him like they're watching a judge, because for them he controls the next chapter, not with kindness, but with contracts and threats and the quiet power of, where else will you go? He starts speaking in that calm voice people use when they want to sound reasonable while delivering something cruel. He talks about repairs, about costs, about how these things happen, and you can see the tenants' faces tightening because these things happen is the sentence that turns disaster into normal life, and normal life is exactly what keeps people trapped in the same conditions that made the fire possible. Somewhere behind him, a man in nicer clothing is already pointing at the damage and whispering numbers to someone else, and you don't need to be a genius to understand what's happening. Because fire creates opportunity the way rain creates mud, there will be rebuilding contracts, there will be quick fixes, there will be cheap wood nailed into place where sturdier material should go. There will be new tenants brought in because desperation is always available, and if the building becomes slightly smaller and slightly worse but the rent stays the same, the landlord will call it unfortunate necessity, and the city will accept it because the city always needs somewhere to put people. The vigiles are still there, but now they move differently, because the fire is not the main enemy anymore. Now the enemies are embers hidden in debris, the kind that smolder quietly and then reignite when everyone stops paying attention, so they poke through the rubble, they check corners, they splash water in places that look innocent. And this part is so boring that most people don't even watch. But it's the part that prevents the street from waking up to the same nightmare again a few hours later. One of them stands with a tablet and starts taking notes, and that's when you realize the city is not only cleaning up, it's recording, because Rome likes records when it serves control. Records help decide who was negligent, who gets punished, who gets fined, who is forced to rebuild a certain way, and who will be ignored because they don't matter enough to punish. A woman approaches the note-taker and starts talking fast, pointing at the ruins, pointing at a neighbor, pointing at the shop. Her voice is pleading and angry at the same time, and you can feel her trying to convert suffering into leverage, trying to turn her loss into a decision made by someone with authority. And the note-taker listens with the expression of a man who has heard the same story 100 times, because in Rome, personal tragedy arrives in patterns, and patterns become paperwork. A small crowd forms around a patch of rubble where someone thinks they saw movement earlier, and suddenly the street holds its breath again, because sometimes the morning after includes the part no one wants, the search for the missing, and the missing in a fire are not missing in a romantic way, they are missing in a practical way, they are missing because smoke confuses you, because stairs become traps, because beams fall, because the crowd blocks exits, because people return for one more thing and the city punishes them for it. Men start pulling debris away in a slow, careful rhythm, not because they are gentle by nature but because pulling the wrong beam can make the pile shift, and the pile shifting can turn a rescue into a burial, and the longer this goes the more you feel the street dividing into two groups, the ones who still hope, and the ones who already know. And the ones who already know are the quietest because quiet is how you protect yourself from the sound of disappointment. When they find someone alive, it's never a clean heroic moment, it's coughing, sputtering, weak movement, soot-stained skin, eyes half-focused, and the crowd reacts with relief that turns quickly into anger, because relief always asks the same question right after it arrives. It asks why this person lived and someone else didn't, and there is no answer that feels fair, and without a fair answer people reach for a target. The shopkeeper becomes a target. He's sitting on a stone step with his head down, hands shaking, staring at the remains of what used to be his livelihood, and people look at him like he's a criminal even if it was an accident, because in a city that burns often, people get tired of accidents, they start treating accidents like moral failures, they start believing somebody must be punished to restore balance. And punishment feels like control even when it's just revenge dressed up. A man steps toward the shopkeeper with that hard forward-leaning posture that says he's about to start a fight, and a VGI stops him, not with a speech, just by standing between them, because the vigiles are not only firefighters, they are order, and order after a disaster is the difference between a damaged street and a street that turns into a riot. And riots happen, especially when people believe the system will not compensate them, because in Rome compensation is not a guarantee, compensation is a privilege, and privileges are negotiated, and if you have no money you might get nothing but sympathy, and sympathy doesn't rebuild a roof. This is the part where the rich man's crew returns, or someone like him, because private power loves the morning after. The morning after is when people are desperate and desperation lowers prices. You hear whispers, he'll buy the lot, he's offering coins now, he'll rebuild fast, and the word fast becomes seductive, because the street has nowhere to sleep tonight, and fast is the difference between shelter and the cold. A tenant argues with another tenant about whether selling is smart. One says, take the money, we need food, the other says, if we sell, we lose everything forever, and both are right in different ways, because disasters turn choices into traps, every option costs you something, and the system doesn't care which pain you pick as long as it remains stable. The city itself begins to reassert its routines around the wreckage, carts still try to pass, vendors start setting up again because trade doesn't stop for your misery, children step around puddles and stare at the blackened walls as if they're learning a lesson they didn't ask for, and you realize Rome's greatest talent is not building temples, it's continuing, it's absorbing shocks. It's stepping over tragedy the way a person steps over a crack in the road, noticing it, avoiding it, moving on. And that's why the state invests in systems like the vigiles, because a city can survive disasters if it keeps moving, but it can only keep moving if someone manages the messy parts, if someone prevents the crowd from becoming the next collapse, if someone stops thieves from turning emergency into harvest, if someone records the story in tablets so later a magistrate can pretend justice happened. The rebuilding begins almost immediately, and the rebuilding is never romantic. It's scaffolding, cheap timber, arguments about who pays, arguments about how much is safe enough, arguments about whether a wall should be thicker, whether an alley should be widened, whether a shop should be allowed to store oil where people sleep above it, and the problem is that every safety improvement costs money and space, and Rome is always short on both. And when a city is short on both, it tends to choose the same answer again and again. It chooses crowdedness, it chooses convenience, it chooses, we'll deal with it later. Later, of course, is another night. Later is another lamp. Later is another street learning the same lesson with a different set of names. And as the sun climbs higher and the smoke finally thins into a faint smell that will linger for days, you can feel the city already forgetting just enough to repeat itself, because forgetting is how Rome keeps functioning. Forgetting is how you walk past a burned building and still buy bread. Forgetting is how you pay rent to the same landlord who rebuilt the same dangerous stairs. Forgetting is how a megacity stays alive. But the people who don't forget are the ones who walk at night, because they can't afford to forget. Their whole job is remembering the shape of disaster before it fully appears, remembering which streets trap crowds, remembering which rooftops catch first, remembering which shopkeepers store oil too close to heat, remembering which neighborhoods burn the fastest, and as the next evening approaches, they adjust their routes, they tighten their patrols, and the city pretends that's enough. It is enough, most nights. Until the night it isn't. And when it isn't, the sound always starts the same way, not with a roar, but with a small wrong crackle somewhere behind a shutter, and the first thread of smoke that slips into a stairwell like a secret, and the moment a sleeping tenant opens a door and asks the most Roman question a person can ask in a city built to burn, "Do you smell that?" As if smell is the only warning the empire ever gives. The question hangs in the corridor for half a heartbeat, and then the entire building answers it at once, not with words but with movement, with doors opening too fast, with feet hitting stairs, with someone coughing so hard it sounds like they're trying to tear the smoke out of their chest, and the worst part is that everyone's first instinct is to go downward because downward feels like outside. But downward is also where the fire usually begins, and Rome loves that cruel arrangement where the exit is the same direction as the danger. A man grips the stair rail and pulls his family forward, and the rail is hot enough to sting, not burning hot yet, but hot in that warning way that tells you the heat has already claimed the space even if the flames haven't shown their face, and he hesitates for the smallest moment, the kind of moment that becomes enormous later, because he can't decide if he should go down through smoke or up toward the roof where there might be air but also might be a trap, and while he is thinking, the crowd behind him is not thinking, the crowd behind him is pressing forward, because in panic there is no personal timeline, there is only pressure. Somewhere below, the street is still wet from last night's fire, puddles reflecting early torchlight like the city refuses to fully dry, and the people who live nearby notice the new smoke before they see it, because your nose becomes trained in Rome the way a soldier becomes trained for distant drums. You learn the difference between cooking smoke and disaster smoke, between warmth and warning, and when the warning smell hits, you don't even finish your thought, you just start moving because hesitation is how you end up as a story other people tell. The Vigilas hear it too, not because they have magic senses but because they've learned to treat certain sounds like alarms, the sudden rush of footsteps inside a building at an unnatural hour, the first ugly cough, the way a crowd's voice shifts from scattered noise into one shared panic tone, and they don't sprint like heroes, they move fast like professionals. Because sprinting makes you tired and tired makes you careless and careless gets you killed when roofs are dropping and smoke is stealing your brain. They arrive at the mouth of the street and the scene is already shaping itself into the familiar pattern, people spilling out of doorways, some carrying bundles that are too heavy for their own good, some carrying nothing because they only managed to grab their child, some standing frozen with their hands at their sides as if their body forgot how to choose, and the Vigilas don't waste time trying to comfort the frozen ones. They push them into motion because in this job, comfort comes after. Survival. One of the men looks up at the building and sees the real problem immediately, not the fire itself but the structure, because the building is tall and narrow and packed with people, and tall narrow packed buildings don't burn like a single room, they burn like a chimney, they pull air upward, they feed the flames by design, and if you're unlucky the stairwell becomes a smoke funnel that turns every attempt to exit into a breathless gamble. Orders snap out, short and sharp, and you can't hear every word but you can hear the effect. The bucket line forms without argument, not because people suddenly became disciplined but because the Vigilas forced discipline by turning the street into lanes. They physically place bodies where they want them, they create a path for water and a path for movement and a path for nobody. Because a path for nobody is how you keep a collapse from turning into a pile of corpses. A man tries to push through, screaming that his father is still inside, and the scream is raw enough to make people flinch, because everyone recognizes that scream, everyone fears making that scream, and one Vijay catches him and holds him back and the man fights like an animal, and the Vijay doesn't win by strength, he wins by certainty, by repeating the same hard sentence in a firm voice, not cruelly, just like a fact. Because facts are what you cling to in a fire, and the fact is that going in blind doesn't increase your father's chances, it just decreases yours. Two Vigilas move toward the doorway with cloths over their faces and they do the ugliest part of rescue, they go low, because smoke rises but the poison still drifts, and they disappear into the darkness for seconds that feel like long minutes to the crowd outside, and during those seconds the crowd does what crowds always do, it invents stories. Someone says they'll never come out, someone says they're fearless, someone says they're fools. And none of those stories matter, because inside the building there is only heat and noise and the feeling of walls sweating. They come back out dragging someone between them, an older man, limp like his body has already decided it's done, and the crowd surges forward instinctively, trying to touch him, trying to help, trying to confirm he's real, and the Vigilas push them back again, because this is the eternal Roman problem, the moment you rescue someone, the crowd becomes a threat to the rescue. The older man coughs once, then again, and each cough sounds like it's scraping ash from the inside of his lungs, and he opens his eyes just enough to see light, and it's such a small moment and yet everyone reacts like it's a miracle, because in a city where disasters repeat, miracles become the only thing that makes people believe tomorrow isn't just another version of today. But the building isn't done, because buildings don't care about your small miracles, they care about physics, and the heat is climbing, and above the doorway the plaster begins to crack in hairline lines that don't look dangerous until they suddenly are, and one of the vigilas backs the line farther away, not because the flames are expanding but because the structure is failing. Because heat eats strength out of wood and stone and mortar the same way hunger eats strength out of people. A hook bites into a beam, a man pulls, another man braces, and a piece of the building comes down in a controlled way, not elegant, not clean, but intentional, and the crowd gasps as if they've witnessed a crime, because to ordinary people it looks like the vigilas are destroying what's left, and to the vigilas it looks like they are cutting the fire's legs out from under it. Someone shouts that this is madness, someone shouts that the vigilas are thieves, someone shouts that the landlord should pay, and the landlord is nowhere to be seen, of course, because the landlord appears when there is profit to collect, not when there is smoke to inhale. The bucket line keeps moving, and water slaps against hot surfaces and turns to steam instantly, and steam rises in ghostly clouds that make it hard to see, and now the street feels like a boiling tunnel, wet stones, hot air, smoke above, shouting inside, and through it all the vigilas keep doing the same boring thing, they keep repeating steps, move the line, keep the lane, watch the roof, watch the wind, stop the crowd, push the curious back, because curiosity kills as reliably as fire. On the edge of the scene, the opportunists return the way they always do, pretending to help while their eyes scan for dropped bundles, for doors left open, for chaos that can be converted into profit, and one of the vigilas peels off to chase a man who is slipping away with something tucked under his arm, and it's almost absurd, the idea of policing theft while a building is burning, but that's Rome. Rome bundles disasters together. Flame and crime and panic in the same narrow space, and if you don't handle all of it, you don't handle any of it. The building finally gives a deep groan, not a crack, a groan, the sound of weight shifting, and everyone who has lived through enough fires recognizes it instantly, because it's the sound that says, "I'm about to become rubble," and the vigilas shout and the crowd moves back in a wave, and for a moment the street becomes strangely orderly, because fear is the best organizer when it's pure enough. A section of wall collapses outward and the sound is thunder in a narrow alley, dust blasting into the air, debris clattering across wet stones, and the fire inside flares as if it's delighted by the fresh air, and the crowd screams again, and in that scream you can hear the truth that never changes, that Rome is not conquered by enemies most nights. Rome is challenged by its own density, its own habits, its own cheap construction, and the price ordinary people pay is measured in burned timber and missing neighbors. The question of payment doesn't arrive like a discussion, it arrives like a slow tightening around everyone's throat, because once the flames shrink the city immediately remembers what it cares about most, which is not your fear, not your coughing, not the soot on your skin, but the boring hard shape of property, responsibility, and power, and in Rome those three things are always sitting at the same table even when nobody admits it. People begin to cluster into smaller groups the way survivors always do, not because they like each other but because being alone after a disaster makes you feel like the city could erase you without witnesses, and in each little cluster someone is already telling a version of the story where they are the most innocent and someone else is the most guilty, because innocence is a shield and guilt is a weapon. And if there is any chance of compensation or reduced rent or help from a patron or mercy from an official, then the story you tell becomes almost as important as the fire itself. A tenant points at the shopkeeper and says it started with his lamp. Another tenant points at the landlord and says it started with his cheap repairs and his rotten beams and the way he kept adding floors like stacking coins, and the shopkeeper's face hardens because he knows exactly what this will become, not a truth hunt, a blame auction, and in an auction the one with the least power usually pays the highest price. Someone mentions the word negligence like they've always been a legal expert. Someone else mentions that the building already had cracks before. Someone else says there were always too many people on the top floors, and all of this is true in the way that Roman life is true. Everything is true and nothing is fixed because the city runs on compromises, and fire punishes compromises brutally. The landlord finally appears, not rushed, not frantic, dressed as if he came to inspect a minor inconvenience, and he stands at the edge of the damage with an expression that tries very hard to be concerned while his eyes are doing arithmetic, and you can almost see him counting future rents, future repairs, future costs, and the easiest path to keeping his profits intact, which is usually to make other people carry the loss. He speaks in measured phrases about unfortunate events and necessary rebuilding. He says he will assess the structure. He says he must speak with builders, and tenants listen with the same tense silence people use when they know they're being set up for disappointment, because they've heard these words before, and in Rome words like assess often mean delay, and delay is how you push desperate people into accepting bad terms. Someone asks where they're supposed to sleep tonight, and the landlord gives a shrug that is almost invisible, because he doesn't want to say the honest answer out loud, which is that their sleeping arrangements are not his problem unless the law makes them his problem, and the law is rarely written to favor people who own nothing but their own exhausted bodies. This is where patronage and connections start to matter, because Rome is not one city. Rome is a network of who knows whom, who owes whom, who can call in a favor, who can lean on a magistrate, who can whisper in the right ear, and if you have a patron, you might get help, you might get temporary shelter, you might get some grain, you might even get a builder sent to fix a wall quickly, but if you don't have anyone, you will discover the most boring cruelty of ancient life, which is that suffering is common enough to be ignored. Vigiles are still present, but now their role is shifting into something colder, because they don't only put out fires, they also mark the scene, they note what happened, they write names, they ask questions that sound simple but are actually traps. Where were you? What were you doing? What did you see first? Who lives on the third floor? Who stores oil? Who cooks late? Who has a workshop? Who has enemies? Because Rome never wastes an opportunity to turn disaster into information, and information is how the state keeps its grip on a city that would otherwise slip into endless private chaos. A man with a wax tablet stands near the wreckage, and the way he writes is calm, too calm for the misery around him, and that calm is what makes people nervous, because calm writing means decisions will follow, fines, punishment, forced repairs, orders to demolish unsafe sections, and people fear demolition almost as much as they fear fire, because demolition is permanent and fire at least feels like an accident. Some tenants argue that the building should be condemned, because they're terrified of returning, but others argue against it immediately, because condemnation means homelessness, and homelessness means being swallowed by the city's hardest layers, sleeping in porticos, sleeping near markets, sleeping near places where thieves and violence gather like flies, and suddenly the safe option becomes dangerous too, and Rome forces you to choose between dangers like it's choosing between sandals. Builders begin to appear because builders always appear after disasters the way birds appear after storms, and not all of them are honest. Some are true craftsmen, some are opportunists with smooth tongues and cheap timber, and they walk around pointing at beams, tapping stone, making serious faces, quoting prices that shift depending on the fear in your eyes. And you can see the landlord talking to them with that secretive closeness that says the rebuilding plan is being shaped without the tenants in the room. Meanwhile, the tenants are doing their own rebuilding, the mental kind. They're making lists of what they lost, what they saved, what matters most now, and those lists aren't poetic, they're practical: a cooking pot, a cloak, a small stash of coins, a tool for work, a baby's blanket, and the most fragile item of all, documents, proof of agreements, proof of identity, proof of debt, because in a bureaucratic empire, paperwork can be the difference between being recognized and being invisible. People begin to mutter about rules, about how the city should widen streets, how upper floors should be limited, how certain shops shouldn't store certain materials under apartments, and these mutters always happen after fires, because fires make people dream of order, but Rome's order is always negotiated against money and space, and money and space usually win. Still, sometimes the state reacts, sometimes there are new inspections, sometimes officials arrive with authority and a public performance of concern, because a visible response helps the city feel governed, and being governed is itself a kind of safety, even when the actual improvements are thin as plaster. A magistrate might come by, surrounded by assistants, looking at the damage with a face practiced in sympathy, asking whether the vigiles responded quickly, asking whether the water supply was sufficient, asking whether the crowd obstructed. And these questions aren't only about future safety, they're also about blame, because if the state can blame panic or negligence, then the state can avoid blaming deeper problems like overcrowding and poor construction, problems that require expensive solutions and political will. And somewhere in the crowd, someone says the dangerous sentence, the one that turns a burned street into a political opportunity. They say that if the city is going to be rebuilt, it should be rebuilt properly, with stronger materials, with better spacing, with clearer access, and at first it sounds like a dream, because it is, but Rome sometimes turns dreams into projects when the right people can profit from it. And that's the part that makes history both depressing and fascinating. Reform is often a cousin of ambition. The landlord hears properly and thinks cost, the tenants hear properly and think survival, the builders hear properly and think contracts, and the officials hear properly and think control, because a rebuilt street can also be a reorganized street, a street that is easier to patrol, easier to tax, easier to manage. And this is how disaster quietly shapes cities, not by inspiring compassion, but by giving power an excuse to rearrange the environment. As the day advances, the smoke smell fades just enough for hunger to return, and hunger is how Rome reminds you that even tragedies have schedules. People need food, people need work, people need to show up to employers who will not accept "my building burned" as a permanent excuse, and so life begins to restart around the wreckage, because in Rome you don't rebuild only houses, you rebuild routines. You rebuild the feeling that you can walk to the market without thinking about flames. But the street isn't healed, it's only moving, and moving doesn't erase the fear, it just hides it under tasks, and when night approaches again, people glance at lamps differently. They watch cooking fires like hawks, they scold children for playing near candles, they demand shutters be closed, they argue about whether someone should stay awake a little longer, just in case, and you can feel the city's anxiety trying to become a habit, trying to become prevention. The vigiles adjust their patrol route, because they always do. The last fire becomes tomorrow's priority. They walk past the blackened building and the tenants watch them like you watch a guard at the edge of a cliff, grateful and resentful at the same time, grateful because they might save you, resentful because their presence reminds you how close your life is to breaking. And the truly boring, truly Roman ending to this section is that nothing feels fully resolved, because in a megacity, resolution is rare. What you get is management, what you get is less bad, what you get is one street surviving while another street begins to smell smoke, and somewhere not far away a shopkeeper trims a wick, and a lamp burns a little too close to a stack of dry goods. And the city holds its breath without realizing it, because Rome doesn't ask whether there will be another fire. Rome only asks where it will happen, and how quickly the system will notice before the crowd becomes the next disaster. The next fire doesn't announce itself with a roar, it arrives like a rumor, slipping into the city's senses before it becomes a visible fact, and the first people to notice are never the officials or the rich, it's always the ones who live closest to risk, the ones above workshops, the ones beside ovens, the ones whose walls are thin enough that heat feels personal. And when one of them leans into a corridor and catches that first wrong taste in the air, it's like their body remembers every other night this has happened, their mouth goes dry before their mind even finishes the thought. A door opens 2 floors up, another door opens across the hall, and at first there's confusion because not every smell is disaster and Rome is full of smells: bread, smoke, sewage, sweat, animals, wet stone, but this smell has a sharpness to it, a rising bite, and it carries the quiet panic of something that is growing while you hesitate, and hesitation is exactly what the fire wants. Because in ancient cities the fire's best ally is delay. Someone runs down the stairs and then stops halfway because the stairwell is already hazy, and the haze is not thick enough yet to blind, but thick enough to warn, thick enough to make your lungs tense like they're bracing for poison, and this is the moment where people make their worst decisions. Because humans hate uncertainty and we prefer a bad certainty over a scary unknown, so some people decide to push through smoke because the outside is down, and other people decide to go up because down feels like death, and the building becomes a maze of conflicting movement. The street below is never fully asleep. Rome always has late voices and early carts and people who live on schedules that don't match the sun, and those late watchers start shouting as soon as the first thread of smoke appears from a window like a gray tongue, and the shout travels faster than any organized signal, it ricochets off stone, it jumps to neighboring streets, it multiplies, fire, 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 until the word stops being information and becomes a sound that pushes bodies into action. You see windows slam open, silhouettes leaning out, faces squinting into darkness trying to locate the source, and in every face there's the same calculation: is it my building, is it next door, is it close enough to jump? And that calculation decides whether you run outside calmly or you run outside with your life in your arms and nothing else. Down near the doorway, flames lick at something inside, not huge yet, but hungry, and the crowd begins forming before the vigiles even arrive, because Rome's first responders are always the nearest people with the least training, and they do what they've seen others do. They form a bucket line, they pull water from a fountain, they shout instructions that conflict, they carry wet cloths, they beat at sparks, and sometimes they save the building right there. Because sometimes a fire dies if it is insulted quickly enough. But when it doesn't die, when it grows into the beams and the stacked goods and the dry partitions, that's when the crowd's effort becomes what it often becomes, brave but insufficient, and bravery without coordination is like throwing handfuls of sand at a storm. The vigiles arrive in segments, not all at once, because Rome is huge and they can't teleport. They are moving through a city that is also moving against them, streets clogged by people rushing toward the scene, people running away from the scene, carts blocked, animals spooked, and yet when they appear the mood shifts, because the crowd recognizes structure, even if they hate it, even if they mistrust it. Structure feels like a rope thrown into water. They push through, they carve space, they assign bodies, they turn a disorderly mass into lanes, and you can almost feel the fire becoming less free the moment the lanes exist, because fire loves crowded chaos. Crowded chaos gives it fuel and confusion and time, and the vigiles are there to steal time back. They don't waste long speeches, they don't narrate their choices, they point, they pull, they throw water where it matters most, they send men to rooftops because the rooftops are where the real battle is decided, not at the doorway where everyone can see, but above, where sparks land quietly and start new flames that nobody notices until the roof itself begins to glow. Two men climb up with careful steps, gripping stone edges, moving across tiles, and on a roof, nighttime is darker, wind is sharper, and smoke makes everything slippery, and they scan for the tiny orange dots that tell you the fire is trying to jump districts, and when they see one they stomp it out, they slap it with a wet cloth, they scrape it away, because the small sparks are the true enemy, the small sparks are how one fire becomes 10. Below, a tenant is screaming that someone is still inside, and you can hear the pitch of that scream, you can tell it's not performance, it's genuine terror, and a VGI grabs him and forces him back, and the crowd reacts with anger like always, because crowds hate restraint, but restraint is the only thing that keeps the scene from becoming a pile of bodies, and the vigiles have seen too many piles to let another one form. They go in again, low, quick, and they come out dragging a woman by her arms, her feet scraping the stone, her hair full of ash, and she coughs so violently that it sounds like her body is trying to escape through her throat, and people rush forward to help, and again the vigiles push them back, because the moment you create a rescue, everyone wants to touch it, and touching it is how it breaks. Water slaps into heat and becomes steam, steam rises and blinds, and the street fills with a ghostly fog that makes the fire feel bigger than it is, and that's dangerous because fear feeds crowds, fear makes people run the wrong way, fear makes them push, and pushing in a narrow street is its own kind of collapse. A hook catches a beam, a wall section is pulled down deliberately, and again you hear the same outrage from people who can't accept that saving a neighborhood might require destroying a home, and that outrage is understandable, because destruction is a trauma even when it's for your own good, but the vigiles keep pulling, because they know what happens if the fire finds a bridge to the next building, if it finds a line of connected wood, if it finds a roof edge, if it finds an overhang. And as they work, you start to see the deeper Roman truth, the one that sits underneath the smoke, that this isn't only a fight against flames, it's a fight against the city's own design choices, against overcrowding, against cheap materials, against landlords who built upward without thinking of escape, against shops storing fuel where people sleep, against the everyday shortcuts that make life affordable until they make life lethal. The fire is slowed, then stalled, then forced back into a smaller area, and after hours it becomes embers, stubborn pockets that hiss and glow, and the street reaches that exhausted stage again where everyone looks older than they did at the beginning of the night, because breathing smoke and fear ages you, and the ground is wet and dirty and full of broken things that used to be somebody's normal life. And then, like it always does, the morning arrives and the next enemy walks in without flames. The enemy is consequences, the enemy is negotiation, the enemy is paperwork and patronage, and the most depressing part is that you can already tell which people will suffer most, because the ones with money can rent a room elsewhere, the ones with connections can call in shelter, and the ones without either will stand in the wreckage staring at the remains of their roof like it was the only sky they were ever allowed. Rumors start immediately, about who started it, about whether the landlord will rebuild, about whether the city will punish someone, about whether inspectors will come, about whether the vigiles wrote down names, and in Rome a written name is like a coin flip. It can mean attention, and attention can be help or harm depending on who you are. A builder appears offering quick repairs, a patron appears offering a loan with invisible strings, a landlord appears talking about unfortunate costs, and the tenants realize that surviving the fire was only the first test. The second test is surviving the system that arrives after, the system that decides whose loss counts and whose loss is just another common tragedy. The street dries, the soot gets swept into corners, vendors return, children step over scorch marks like they're stepping over chalk drawings, and Rome resumes its noise because Rome cannot afford silence for long. Silence feels like weakness in a capital that lives on movement. But the people who were there don't forget as quickly as the city does. They look at lamps differently, they flinch at the smell of smoke even when it's harmless, they listen at night for the wrong crackle, and they learn the quiet skill every Roman eventually learns, the skill of living as if disaster is always a neighbor, because in a city built tight and tall and hungry, it is. And somewhere down another alley, another wick is trimmed, another flame is lit, and the cycle continues, not because anyone wants it, but because Rome is a machine made of habits, and habits burn slowly until they don't burn slowly at all. The cycle doesn't feel like a cycle when you're inside it, it feels like separate bad nights stitched together by the same smell, and after enough of those nights the city starts to develop a kind of superstition that looks like wisdom from far away. People begin to place lamps farther from curtains, they begin to keep water jars closer to doors, they begin to argue with neighbors about shared stairwells. They begin to treat wooden beams the way sailors treat storms, not with respect exactly, but with a wary awareness that the thing above your head can decide your future without asking. You see it in small habits first, the kind nobody writes down, a mother making her children sleep with their sandals close, a father keeping a small pouch of coins tied under his tunic even at home, a shopkeeper storing oil in smaller containers instead of one big jar because a big jar is a single mistake with a large consequence, and these habits don't stop fires, they just make people feel like they've negotiated with fate. And in a city like Rome, feeling like you've negotiated with fate is sometimes the only comfort you can afford. But the city also develops official habits, and official habits are always about visibility and control, because an empire cannot look helpless, not in its own capital, not when it rules half the world. So after a stretch of bad nights, after enough streets blackened and enough complaints muttered in the markets, there's a shift in tone. You hear it in the way officials speak about public safety, with that tight smile that means they're about to make it someone's duty, someone's responsibility, someone's punishment if it goes wrong. Inspections become more frequent in some districts, not everywhere because Rome never does anything evenly, but enough that people start to recognize the signs, an official with assistants, a man with a tablet, a few stern faces looking up at upper floors, tapping beams, asking questions that sound simple but are sharp underneath. How many people live here? What is stored below? What is cooked at night? Who owns the property? Who is responsible for repairs? And when those questions land, the tenants often look at the landlord and the landlord often looks away, because responsibility is a word everyone loves until it comes with a cost attached. Landlords respond the way landlords always respond, by doing the cheapest thing that can be defended as enough. They patch, they plaster, they replace a beam here and there, they promise improvements later, they complain about expenses loudly so tenants feel guilty for expecting safety, and sometimes, just sometimes, they make real changes if they fear a fine or a public embarrassment. Because fear moves money faster than compassion ever does. Builders become the quiet winners in this world, because every fire turns into work, and work turns into contracts, and contracts turn into influence, and influence in Rome is not only political, it's social, it's who gets invited, who gets recommended, who gets trusted, and in the mornings after fires you'll see builders walking confidently through soot like they own the street, because in a way they do. The street is now a project, and projects attract coin like bees to sweetness. The vigiles develop their own routine around these patterns, their patrol routes start to look like a map of risk, they pay more attention to certain alleys, certain trades, certain clusters of upper floors that look too crowded, and you can feel how a system evolves, not through grand reforms, but through repeated small adjustments, through men learning where fires like to start, through men learning which neighborhoods panic first, through men learning which crowds turn into stampedes and which crowds can be molded into bucket lines without breaking. And yet, no matter how well they learn, there's always the night when the city decides to remind everyone that control is an illusion, the night when wind turns an ordinary fire into a traveling one, the night when sparks don't just rise, they drift, and drift is deadly because drift ignores your lanes and your lines and your shouted orders. Drift makes the rooftops into a game board and the fire into a player that moves without needing roads. On that kind of night, everything becomes louder and faster, not just the flames but the decisions, because you can hear it in the vigiles' voices, you can hear it in the way they stop trying to save individual rooms and start thinking in blocks, you can hear it in the way hooks come out earlier, the way they look at the next building and already see it as a sacrifice, and the crowd senses that shift too. And when the crowd senses sacrifice, the crowd becomes emotional, because sacrifice means someone's home is going to be broken on purpose, and people don't accept, on purpose, the way they accept accident, on purpose feels like betrayal. A tenant screams that they can still save the upper rooms, that the flames aren't there yet, that there's time, and a VGI answers with a gesture that says no, because the VGI is watching the wind, and wind is the real dictator now. Wind decides which roof catches next, wind decides which street becomes a corridor of heat, wind decides how many minutes you have, and minutes are already running out like spilled water down a slope. The hooks bite and pull, the beams snap, a roof section comes down, and the sound of it is not just wood cracking, it's a life cracking, it's the end of "I live here," and the beginning of "I live there," and the crowd roars with anger and grief because grief loves to be loud, and some people surge forward not even to fight the vigiles, but to save something from the destruction before it happens, to grab a chest, to grab cloth, to grab a tool, to grab anything that proves their life isn't about to be erased by a decision made in smoke. That surge is where disaster always tries to multiply, because a surge is a stampede waiting to happen, and the vigilas throw their bodies into it, pushing, blocking, forcing the crowd back, because if the crowd gets too close at the moment the roof falls, the roof doesn't care about your grief, it falls anyway, and grief becomes death, and then the city has two disasters instead of one. Someone slips on wet stone and drops a bucket, the bucket rolls, water splashes uselessly into the gutter, and a man shouts at him like it's his fault, because in panic people need targets, they need to believe someone caused the chaos, because believing someone caused it means someone could have prevented it, and prevention is the fantasy everyone clings to while the air burns. Above, on the rooftops, the men stationed there are fighting the invisible war, stamping out sparks, dragging wet cloths across tiles, scraping away anything that can catch, and their work is so unglamorous that nobody cheers for it, but without them the fire would leap, and leaping is how Rome loses control entirely, because once a fire is leaping, it stops being one street's emergency and starts being a city's humiliation. And humiliation is what Rome fears most, because an empire can tolerate suffering, it cannot tolerate looking incapable, not in front of its own citizens, not in front of visitors, not in front of the endless stream of people who come to the capital expecting marble order and finding smoky chaos instead. So when the night finally ends, when the wind calms or the fire is boxed in through sheer stubborn effort, the morning after has a different taste. It's not just grief and bargaining, it's also pressure from below and above at the same time, tenants demanding safer buildings, officials demanding visible solutions, landlords demanding the right to rebuild cheaply, builders demanding contracts. And the vigila is standing in the middle knowing that everyone wants them to be the answer even though they are only a tool. You start hearing rumors of new rules, not dramatic ones, but rules that sting in practical ways, talk about limiting height, talk about requiring certain materials, talk about keeping hazardous trades away from crowded housing, talk about widening access routes, and every rumor becomes a debate because every rule is a fight over space and money, and Rome is greedy with both. Some streets get slightly wider, not because Rome suddenly loves safety, but because wider streets make it easier for authority to move, for patrols to pass, for crowds to be controlled, for fires to be accessed, and that's the thing about many safety reforms in big cities. They help people, yes, but they also help governance, and in Rome those two goals often ride the same cart. Tenants in rebuilt buildings notice small changes, new walls, new partitions, sometimes more stone, sometimes less wood, sometimes a different layout that makes escape easier, and they feel gratitude mixed with suspicion, because gratitude is risky, gratitude can make you accept bad things again. And suspicion is what keeps you alive in a city where your roof can collapse and your landlord will still ask for rent next month like nothing happened. And yet, even with changes, the fear never fully leaves, because Rome still runs on flame, and flame is still the cheapest way to light a room, to cook a meal, to work late, and as long as people need those things, the city will always be carrying 1,000 little risks in its hands, and every risk is a story waiting to happen. That's the strange quiet ending of every Roman fire season, not a grand never again, but a tired we'll try, and in the evenings, when lamps are lit and shutters are closed, the city looks normal from far away, like a glowing jewel, but up close you can hear it. The soft crackle of wicks, the small hiss of oil, the tiny sounds that are harmless most nights and lethal on the wrong one. And the people who understand this best are the ones who keep walking the streets when everyone else wants to sleep, because they're not fighting a single fire, they're fighting the fact that Rome itself is always one careless moment away from becoming smoke again. By the time enough nights have passed, the city stops reacting like each fire is a surprise and starts reacting like each fire is a budget item, and that's when you notice the most Roman transformation of all, the way disaster slowly turns into administration, the way fear turns into paperwork, and the way the people in charge begin to treat smoke not as tragedy but as a question of order. Because order is what keeps a capital from feeling like a crowded accident. In the market, you hear the same conversations looping, not about gods or glory, but about practical things that sound boring until you realize they are life and death, which alley is safest, which building has the worst stairs, which landlord patched his beams with real wood and which one patched them with promises, which shops are storing oil beneath sleeping rooms, which street has a fountain close enough to matter. And people trade this information like it's currency because sometimes it is. Sometimes knowing the right street keeps you alive longer than knowing the right prayer. In the taverns, the stories get uglier and more specific, because Rome loves a story and taverns love a villain, and the villains are always familiar: the landlord who raised rent after rebuilding, the builder who used cheap timber, the official who took a bribe to overlook something, the neighbor who left a lamp too close to cloth, the rich man who showed up to a fire with a crew and a contract instead of a heart. And the more these stories circulate, the more you can feel the city's mood shifting from acceptance into resentment, because there's a point where accident stops being believable and starts feeling like a system. And systems create tension, because once people believe the suffering is shaped by choices, they start demanding different choices, and demands in Rome are dangerous, not always in open rebellion, but in the slow corrosive way that makes a city harder to manage, harder to tax, harder to keep calm, and that's why the state cares about fire control more than it admits, because a burning city is not only a physical risk, it's a political one. So you begin to see the performance of authority around fire, not just the response, but the display, the inspections, the patrols that walk slightly more visibly, the punishments that get announced loudly, the symbolic fines that tell the public, we are doing something, even if the deeper causes stay untouched, and the public watches all of it with that Roman skepticism that says, show me results, not speeches. Some mornings, after a particularly nasty night, you see officials walking through the wreckage with assistants, stepping carefully over soot like they're visiting a wounded animal, and they ask questions that sound concerned but feel like they're searching for a convenient explanation. Was the shop storing flammable materials? Were the tenants cooking late? Did the bucket line obstruct? Did the crowd riot? Did the vigiles arrive quickly enough? And every question is a fork in the road, because depending on the answer, the blame can land on the poor, or on the trades, or on public disorder, and if the blame lands on public disorder, then the solution becomes more policing, more control, more authority, and the state likes solutions that strengthen the state. Tenants notice that too. They notice how quickly fire safety becomes crowd control, how quickly a disaster becomes an excuse to regulate movement, to widen certain lanes, to mark certain routes, to enforce certain closures at night, and some people welcome it because any control feels better than chaos, while others hate it because control always comes with someone else holding the handle. Meanwhile, rebuilding begins again, and rebuilding is where the story gets quietly brutal, because rebuilding looks hopeful from far away, scaffolding rising, new beams, fresh plaster, but up close you see the same old compromises slipping back in like familiar lies, because Rome is impatient, people need rooms, landlords want rent, builders want speed, and speed is often the enemy of safety. A builder stands with the landlord and speaks in that confident tone that says, "I can make it look fixed by next week," and the landlord likes that tone because next week means income, and the tenants like that tone because next week means a roof, and nobody likes to ask what "fixed" really means in a city where the cheapest wood is always available and the strictest enforcement is always negotiable. New partitions go up, sometimes thinner than the old ones, new stairs get added, sometimes steeper, sometimes narrower, because space is money, and every inch of space that becomes safe clearance is an inch of space that stops making profit, and profit in Rome is persuasive. Profit convinces people to gamble with other people's lungs. You can feel the tenants' fear harden into a habit. They start doing private inspections with their eyes, they look at stairwells, they look at beams, they look at how close the downstairs trade is to their sleeping area, and if something looks wrong they complain, and the landlord smiles and says it's fine, and the tenant knows it might not be fine, but the tenant also knows they don't have many options, and that's how unsafe cities stay unsafe. Not because people don't understand danger, but because people are trapped inside it. The vigiles keep walking, and their work starts to look less like emergency response and more like routine prevention, because prevention is what systems do once they've been embarrassed enough times. They check for hazards, they warn shopkeepers, they tell people to store oil properly, they pressure certain trades to follow rules, and sometimes those warnings stick, and sometimes they don't. Because rules in Rome are strong when they have teeth and weak when they have exceptions, and exceptions are everywhere. At night, the city feels calmer on the surface, because when people have fresh disaster memory they behave, they keep flames smaller, they close shutters, they reduce late cooking, they whisper instead of shouting, as if quiet might stop sparks, but beneath that calm you can feel the tension, the way everyone is waiting for the next mistake, the way every small crackle in a lamp suddenly sounds like a threat, and you realize a city can be functioning and still be terrified, and Rome is very good at functioning while terrified. Then one evening, not dramatic, not announced, just an ordinary evening with ordinary routines, the system gets tested again in a new way, not by a single building but by two fires in different parts of the city, and this is where all the boring logistics become life itself, because a system can handle one emergency, but two at once forces choices, and choices reveal priorities. Word runs through the streets like it always does, first fire near one district, second fire a little farther, and the message mutates as it travels. Some people say it's arson, some people say it's an omen, some people say it's thieves creating distractions, and whether any of that is true doesn't matter in the first hour because what matters is that resources split, buckets split, men split. And the city suddenly feels bigger and more dangerous because help is no longer coming, help is being divided. You see the vigiles making hard decisions fast, sending one group toward the larger blaze, sending another to contain the smaller one before it becomes large, and the crowd doesn't love these decisions, because crowds never love being told that their emergency is second priority. But that's what organization is, it's choosing where the limited strength goes, and limited strength is the reality no empire likes to admit. In the smaller fire, the crowd tries to become its own system again, bucket line, wet cloths, shouting, and it almost works, and that almost is the most dangerous feeling, because when people believe they're winning they take risks, they run closer, they push in, they breathe deeper, and then the smoke proves it doesn't care about your confidence. Someone collapses, another person tries to drag them, the crowd surges. And suddenly the small fire creates a human disaster that is harder to fix. Then the flame. By the time the vigiles arrive, they're not only fighting heat, they're untangling bodies, forcing a lane through a crowd that has wrapped itself around the doorway, pushing people away from danger they refuse to respect, and you can see the frustration in their movements, because they know the hardest part of their job isn't water, it's people, it's convincing frightened humans to behave like a planned mechanism. The larger fire is worse, because large fires in Rome don't just burn, they transform, they create wind, they create their own breath, they suck air through streets, they turn alleys into chimneys, and the rooftops become a field of invisible war again, sparks landing, men stamping, cloths slapping tiles, and every spark that dies quietly is a block that doesn't become a nightmare. In the middle of that, someone accuses the vigiles of arriving late, because someone always does, and a vigile ignores it, because late is relative when you're running across a megacity, and the accusing voice is less about reality and more about fear trying to punish somebody, because fear needs to blame, fear needs a target to hit when it can't hit the fire. After hours, the fires shrink, contained through sheer stubborn repetition of the same boring steps, lane, bucket, hook, roof watch, crowd control, and when the city finally settles into that exhausted morning again, 2 different streets are blackened, 2 sets of tenants are staring at rubble, and now the conversation changes, because one fire is a tragedy, 2 fires start to feel like a pattern. And patterns make people ask questions that threaten comfort. Was it negligence, or was it someone setting fires? And if it was someone setting fires, then the problem isn't only safety, it's security, and security in Rome invites harsher control, more patrols, more searches, more suspicion, and suspicion is a poison that spreads through crowded streets almost as fast as smoke. The city begins to whisper about arsonists, because arsonists are a story that makes sense to people. An arsonist is a villain you can imagine catching. An arsonist is simpler than admitting the entire city is built like tinder, and authorities often prefer simple villains too, because simple villains justify simple crackdowns, and simple crackdowns are easier than expensive reforms. So the night patrols become stricter, more visible, more aggressive, and shopkeepers feel it, tenants feel it, people feel eyes on them in a new way, and some people feel safer, and some people feel hunted, because safety for one group often looks like harassment for another, and Rome, like all big cities, doesn't distribute discomfort fairly. And yet, despite all of this, despite patrols and rules and inspections and rebuilding, the core truth remains sitting in the center of the city like a stubborn stone. Rome is crowded, Rome is flammable, Rome is built for human convenience more than human safety, and that means every improvement is a layer, not a cure, every reform is a patch, not a redesign, and patches hold until they don't. That's why the people who survive longest aren't always the bravest or the richest, sometimes they're simply the most attentive, the ones who learn to notice the wrong smell early, the ones who keep their sandals near the bed, the ones who can wake up and choose a direction fast, up or down, roof or street, and that choice, that small boring choice made in a smoky corridor, is often what decides whether you become a survivor telling stories in a tavern or a name scratched onto a tablet nobody reads twice. As the days pass, the burned streets stop being the story and start being the scenery, because Rome is cruelly talented at turning fresh tragedy into background, and once a disaster becomes background the city returns to its favorite behavior, it repeats the same risky routines but with a thin layer of caution painted over them, like plaster over cracked stone. The landlord rebuilds just enough to start collecting again, the builder finishes fast enough to move to the next contract, the tenants move back in because they don't have a better option, and the same stairwell that filled with smoke now fills with normal noise again, footsteps, arguments, someone laughing, someone cooking too late, and every time a lamp is lit there's a tiny pause in the hand that lights it, a pause that wasn't there before. Because memory is the only free safety improvement most people get. The vigiles keep patrolling, and after the two-fire night their routes feel heavier, not in distance but in meaning. They check doorways more often, they listen more carefully, they stop more strangers, they warn more shopkeepers, and the city both thanks them and complains about them, because Rome always wants protection and freedom at the same time, even when those two things don't fit in the same narrow alley. Rumors about arson drift and fade the way rumors always do, because rumors are exciting until people get hungry again, and hunger wins attention, so the city settles into a tense normal. But normal in Rome still includes small accidents, a cooking fire that jumps, a lamp that tips, a workshop that smolders, and most of these don't become disasters because people react fast, because they're afraid now, because they've seen what happens when you don't. And then, quietly, the real result of all this shows up not in flames but in behavior. Tenants start choosing lower floors when they can, shopkeepers store oil more carefully if they fear inspection, some streets become known as safer, some become known as traps, and people adjust their lives around the invisible map of risk, because that's how you survive in a city that can't be rebuilt from scratch. The city keeps moving, and that movement is Rome's greatest strength and its greatest lie, because it makes everything seem stable, it makes the empire feel unbreakable, and yet stability is often just a habit of recovering, a habit of patching, a habit of stepping over scorch marks and calling it progress. So the lesson of Rome's fires isn't that they solved the problem, it's that they learned to live with it, they built routines around it, patrols around it, rules around it, and those routines saved lives, but they never erased the core risk, they only kept it from swallowing the whole city at once. And in the end, that's what made Rome feel eternal to the people inside it, not that it never burned, but that it kept standing after it did. The scorch marks don't disappear quickly, not on stone, not in people's heads, and even when the street looks normal again there's a different kind of quiet logic running underneath everything, like the city has added one more rule to its invisible rulebook. Don't trust the night to stay calm just because it was calm yesterday. Tenants move back in with the strange posture of people returning to a place that betrayed them, they climb the rebuilt stairs more carefully, they test each step with a foot before putting full weight on it, they glance at beams the way you glance at a stranger who once raised a hand at you, and the landlord is there in the background smiling the way landlords smile when the rent will resume, talking about improvements, about stronger materials, about good fortune, that it wasn't worse, and the tenants hear those phrases as if they're hearing theater, because the real improvement they wanted was not a better phrase, it was not having to choose between danger and homelessness. The rebuilt rooms smell different at first, fresh plaster, wet wood, lime, a smell that tries to promise safety, but smells are liars, and after a few days the old smells creep back in, cooking smoke, stale air, sweat, the city's permanent dampness in hidden corners, and the tenants realize what they already knew, the building may look new, but the lifestyle is the same crowdedness, the same late work, the same lamps and candles, the same need to stretch time and space to survive. Shopkeepers learn quickly too, because shopkeepers are punished fast when systems tighten. They start storing oil more carefully, they keep flammable goods away from heat, not because they became saints overnight but because they feel eyes on them now, and in Rome being watched is a kind of pressure that can improve behavior when morality doesn't, and you can tell the difference between fear-driven caution and real reform by how long it lasts. Because fear is strong for a month and weak after a season. The vigiles continue their rounds, and the rounds become more than walking, they become a presence, the sound of footsteps at certain hours, the flash of a torch turning a corner, the brief moment when a patrol stops at a doorway and listens, and that presence changes the street the way a guard changes a marketplace. It makes some people feel safer, it makes some people feel judged, and it makes the city feel managed. Which is the true goal of systems in capitals, to make chaos look like it has limits. They warn people more often now, and warnings sound boring until you remember what happens when warnings are ignored. Keep the stairwell clear, store oil properly, don't cook in the corridor, don't block the lane, don't build extra partitions without approval, and every warning becomes a tiny negotiation, because the person receiving it is always thinking of convenience and the VGI is always thinking of disaster. And between convenience and disaster there is always a gap, and that gap is where most cities actually live. Sometimes those negotiations turn sharp. A shopkeeper complains that rules will ruin him, a tenant complains that there is nowhere else to put their belongings, a landlord complains about expenses, and the VGI doesn't argue deeply because the VGI is not paid to solve poverty, he's paid to reduce visible catastrophe, and Rome prefers solutions that reduce catastrophe without changing the economy that produces it. Still, small changes accumulate, because systems, even imperfect ones, slowly carve habits into people. A street learns to keep water containers near certain points, a neighborhood learns who runs first to the fountain, a building learns which windows to open and which stairs to avoid, and these learned behaviors are like muscle memory, not pretty, not heroic, but effective enough that some fires are caught early and die before they become an event. But the city doesn't give up its worst habit, the habit of forgetting just enough to repeat itself, because time softens fear, fear fades, and when fear fades, the lamps inch closer to curtains again, the workshops fill with more goods, the upper floors become more crowded, the stairwell becomes cluttered, and all the careful behavior starts slipping back toward convenience. You can watch it happen week by week, like a wound closing over a weakness. At first everyone flinches at smoke, then only some people flinch, then only the ones who lived through the worst night, and eventually new tenants arrive who didn't see the fire, who don't have the memory, who treat the city like it's stable because it looks stable, and stability is convincing when you're new to it. Then, on a different night, not connected to the old fire except by the city's nature, another small mistake happens, and this time the neighborhood reacts faster, because the system taught them speed, the bucket line forms quickly, the street clears more cleanly, the vigiles arrive to a scene that is already half organized, and you see how routine can save lives, how repetition can sharpen response, how boring logistics can act like a shield. The fire is contained early, the damage smaller, the panic shorter, and people feel proud for a moment, proud that they did it right, proud that Rome can handle itself, and that pride is dangerous too, because pride whispers the city is safer than it is. Pride invites complacency, and complacency is the quiet partner of the next disaster. Because the truth is, Rome's safety isn't a wall, it's a balancing act, and the balance depends on too many fragile things, on patrols actually being present, on water access not being blocked, on people not panicking, on landlords not cutting corners, on trades not being reckless, on wind not turning cruel, and any one of those slipping can make the night go bad again.